Street Fighter VI is set to introduce a whole new generation of fighters later this year, but this isn't exactly a new concept for fighting games. In fact, the concept of new generations goes back almost 3 decades. So let's discuss how various series have handled the concept, from the successes to the failures, and see what Capcom or any other fighting game developer can learn from these previous attempts to make their next one a hit. The first of these next generation sequels was 1996's Tekken 3. The game is set 19 years after the previous game and features a new protagonist, Jin Kazama. Generally speaking, I get the sense that this still remains the most popular and successful new generation in the genre, so let's try and figure out what about it works so well. First, I think it coming so early in the series helps a lot, because the veteran fighters had only been in 1 or 2 games prior, so they weren't exactly iconic must-haves that fans will spit their dummies out over if they're absent. Second, the game's roster is a healthy split of old guard and newcomers, at least when you take into account those that are functionally identical to their predecessors. And speaking of, most of the newcomers actually come equipped with movesets of characters from the previous game, or at least ones derived from them. This is another way of softening the blow, as if your main in Tekken 2 was Michelle Chang, for example, you can just play as her near identical daughter who inherited her moves. And with so many newcomers being students or children of previous fighters, or even with less direct connections like Eddie with Kazuya, this allows those absent fighters to still have some presence within the narrative, even if they died to pave the way for their successor. All this to say, the game goes out of its way to soften the blow of suddenly dropping the majority of the cast from the prior 2 games through both story and gameplay, while still having some standout newcomers like Eddie Gordo. The game also utilises the absence of past fighters to cleverly set up the final boss, Ogre, who has stolen moves from those fighters after defeating them and, until later games brought most of them back, presumably killing them. An inherent aspect of the transition to the new generation being used to hype up the new threat is one of the short-term ways this game succeeds. And, of course, we can't discuss the new generation without discussing the new protagonist, as this character serves as the face of this new era, and they had damn well better make an impression to win over the fans and make them feel like this new development was a good one. Tekken 3 introduces Jin Kazama, son of Tekken 1 protagonist and Tekken 2 antagonist Kazuya Mishima. I'd wager that there is another reason this went over so well. Tekken already changed protagonists between the first 2 games, but Jin isn't just a carbon copy of Kazuya. His moveset is an amalgamation of his father's and his mother Jun Kazama's moveset to impress the idea of newness. He is a little younger, a little broodier, with a bit more of the classic struggle against the inner darkness that Kazuya lost, setting up future storylines that would determine if Jin would go down the same path as his father, or take more after his kind mother. He's similar enough to Kazuya to feel familiar, but different enough and with enough setup for future stories to be his own character and to add a new dimension to the Mishima saga. And with Jin's place in this particular family, once Kazuya came back in the next game, we had the groundwork laid for the whole fight the old hero trope, with a very compelling narrative setup that isn't just done for the sake of being cool. So with all of that laid out, was Tekken 3 a successful new generation? Absolutely. It remains the highest reviewed entry to this day, and was only topped in sales by 7 around 2 decades later. While the series got to work slowly bringing back the veterans over the next few games, the new cast have been consistently part of the roster ever since, and Jin remained the protagonist through Tekken 5, became the antagonist in Tekken 6, and is set to return to the protagonist spot in Tekken 8, barring something insanely stupid happening. Again, the only failure would be Forest Law being replaced by his father, the very man he replaced 1 game later. Aside from that, Jin, Ling Xiaoyu, Brian Fury and Eddie Gordo are just as iconic as Heihachi, Kazuya or Nina Williams. Tekken 3 is the benchmark for a good new generation. Some of it is down to how the series was built prior to it, but a lot of what made it work really is down to how Tekken 3 itself was constructed. Very well done. On the other end of the spectrum, we have 1997's Street Fighter III The New Generation. Yes, Capcom tried this before SF6 and it wasn't quite as successful as its Namco rival. I mean, the fact that the faces of Street Fighter Cross Tekken are Kazuya and Jin, and Ryu and M. Bison should tell you a lot. SF3, right off the bat, did away with everyone but Ryu and Ken, and the original plan was to leave them out as well. Everyone but them is a newcomer, and the only one with a connection to a previous character is Sean, the apprentice of Ken, who is, again, still on the roster. Aside from the 2 Shotos, we get nothing on icons like Chun-Li, Cammy, Guile, or the entire Shadaloo cast. Yes, in one of the 2 times Capcom has done this, they built up the series' big threat to overcome and had them go down in between games, and thus Bison's entire faction is absent. Street Fighter, by this point, had SF1, 2, the Alpha Trilogy, EX, and numerous crossover games and spin-offs to cement the World Warriors in the upper echelon of fighting game icons. So removing almost all of them, and having no story connections or characters to pick up their movesets to accommodate old fans on the gameplay front was Certainly a bold choice. This being Street Fighter, 2 further editions were released, bringing back Akuma and then Chun-Li. But aside from Hugo from Final Fight, none of the newcomers had any sort of connection to the old characters. In the end, Third Strike's roster feels more like a new series with a few SF characters thrown in there. It's like trying to sell Rival Schools as a Street Fighter game just because Sakura is in it. But instead of the obvious choice of Sakura as Ryu's successor in the protagonist role, we were instead given an all-new character with zero connection to him, Alex. In essence, you want your new hero to feel familiar but unique, reminiscent of the old hero to not be too large a departure, but with enough of a unique style and potential for future storylines that fans feel like the change is worth it. Jin just about rides that line as Kazuya and Jun's successor, but Alex isn't even trying to maintain his balance. He just swan dives off the tightrope into the streets below and onto some poor Andre the Giant lookalike. We've gone from a calm, reserved karate man with an inner darkness to a giant blonde Hulk Hogan inspired grappler with zero story connection to any prior Street Fighter character or plotline. Again, remove Ryu and Ken and New Generation could easily be its own IP made to appeal to Americans, because it apparently was going to be a new IP originally. Alex is a fine character, but not necessarily what fans would want taking over the lead from Ryu, especially when Ryu's personal storyline wasn't over yet. And the idea of Alex and Ryu clashing wasn't particularly interesting since the two have zero connection to each other. Alex versus Hugo is more exciting, and that's purely down to the Hogan and Andre thing. So, was this new generation a success? No. It's introduced good characters who have continued to appear in subsequent games, and Third Strike is currently considered one of the greatest fighting games of all time, but I think it says a lot that SF4 and 5 went right back to relying on the World Warriors to fill their rosters, with Alex not even returning until 5, and being set before 3 in the timeline. And now SF6 is finally moving things forward beyond 3, with a new generation spearheaded by newcomer Luke. Luke is helping to usher in a whole new vibe for Street Fighter with its urban aesthetic seeping out of both the visuals and the soundtrack, and it looks like Capcom has learned their lesson from 3 with 6's roster having a much larger contingent of veteran fighters than 3. Let's just hope it worked out better for them so we don't have to spend the next decade stuck in SF2's shadow as well. In 1999, Capcom's biggest rival SNK took a shot at a new generation with Garou Mark of the Wolves, a new generation for the Fatal Fury series. In a way, FF was already a new gen title due to the prequel series Art of Fighting, but in all seriousness, the distinction between Fatal Fury and Garou in the title makes the game feel more like a spin-off, as if SNK weren't necessarily dedicated to the idea of moving things forward and wanted a way to back down if Garou wasn't a hit. Okay, technically Garou is the Japanese name for Fatal Fury and it was just the Western versions not changing the name this time, but it still has that vibe, okay? Garou has only one returning fighter, FF protagonist Terry Bogard, but it also features Kim Kapuan's sons, Kim Jae-hoon and Kim Dong-hwan, and the new protag Rock Howard, who had all appeared in numerous Fatal Fury titles in the story, but never in gameplay. Other newcomers have connections to prior characters like Ryo's apprentice and Geese Howard's brother-in-law, and it still revolves around the KOF tournament in Southtown, so it definitely manages to retain the feel of the prior game's setting. It doesn't carry movesets over like Tekken 3, but it does give characters the same fighting styles with moveset similarities to varying degrees to ease players into the new era. Rock is unique in that, of the 3 new generation heroes thus far, he is the only one to be an existing character, being the son of the original antagonist, taken in by the protagonist after his father's death at said protagonist's hand, and becoming Terry's surrogate son. He has shades of Jin Kazuma as the heir to both a heroic and villainous legacy, with his prior appearances helping to set him up as a natural successor to Terry, and the potential to struggle with his father's cursed legacy that may drive him to seek to avenge his biological father against his foster father. Needless to say, Rock is probably the pinnacle of good successor fighters. Did Garou succeed as a new direction? It's complicated. Rock definitely proved successful, showing up in multiple KOF games since, even if the timeline doesn't line up one bit. In fact, a fair few of these characters have shown up in KOF and other crossovers, so they were certainly taken to by the fans, but SNK were going through all kinds of monetary and ownership struggles around that time, so their focus shifted to the more consistently successful KOF brand, and has pretty much remained there ever since. They had to play it safe, so continuing with this still fairly risky new generation thing was not on the table. However, the fact that they made a canonical short film to somewhat continue the story where Garou left off is quite telling of the desire of the devs to continue the saga and with fans to see it happen. And then they announced a new Garou in the works with Rock front and centre after I wrote this, so I guess in the end, yes, it was a success. 2012 SoulCalibur V was the next one and was probably the highest profile new generation game since Tekken 3, seeing how I feel the other two aren't discussed as such nearly as much. After 5 prior games, SoulCalibur moved its story forward 17 years. As with Tekken 3, barely any of the women returned, and we got a bunch of newcomers using the movesets of previous characters. The story now focused on the 2 children of Sophia, who had been the focus of her story since their births between Soul Blade and SoulCalibur 1. Sadly, neither one is worthy of their mother's sacrifice. SC5, unusually for the series, dropped the typical extravagant side modes in favour of a cinematic story mode centred on Patroclus and Pyrrha. Sadly, this mode is one of the worst in the genre. See, the team was given around a year to make the game, and Tekken Tag 2 soaked up a lot of the manpower and focus at the time, and then it underperformed in arcades. I've also heard the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami heavily impacted the game's development. As such, around 75% of the narrative had to be axed, and the only possible way this was going to be at all coherent was if what was kept was just the core narrative of the siblings, with cameos by other characters where they could fit. As a result, there's no time to properly introduce or characterise any of the other newcomers, and without the series' standard bios either, most fans have no way of knowing anything about these characters or what became of the older cast, not even the ones that are still here, without either owning the art book or looking on the wikis. One of the biggest losses in that regard surrounds Maxie's group, which consists of the successors of fan favourites Taki, Keelik and Xianghua. They get 2 brief appearances in the story and contribute very little, even in the way of characterisation or background. There is nothing in the game to tell you, for example, that Shiba is Keelik and Xianghua's bastard son and the half-brother of his travelling companion Leicia. As a result, the new generation cast feel hollow, be they less interesting copies of their predecessors, different by way of being the total opposite and nothing more, or literally just the same character with a "the second" on the end. The main focus of the story is Patroclus and Pyrrha Alexandra. Patroclus is the primary protagonist and his sister is the secondary protagonist and later antagonist. After a poor introduction where Patroclus murders civilians because he thinks they're evil monsters because a transparently evil man told him so, he very quickly abandons the sister he spent years searching for because she turned into a monster to protect him. Having your hero start out with flaws is good, but there aren't enough redeeming traits here to endear the audience to him to make them want to see him redeemed. He just keeps making huge mistakes, growing more and more out of hand until only a convenient time travel opportunity in the 3rd act lets him fix them. And he doesn't feel like he's developed at all by the end, aside from accepting his sister even if she is a malfested. And Pyrrha is just a weak, feeble, easily led young woman whose personality and voice make her effectively a discount Sengoku Basara Oichi, but without the tragic life that made the latter work. Her mother died to save her, then when she tries to save her brother gets rejected, and it's sad and all, but it feels a bit too sudden to lead into her possession by Soul Edge, although this could be a result of the cut story and maybe it was supposed to have more build up. Either way, she's so weak and needy that it's easy to forget she's a year older than her more proactive younger brother. It's to the point that the audience will likely feel pity for her more than feeling bad for her. She really puts the pathetic back in sympathetic. And when Patroclus meets old hero Siegfried, a man who spent years under Soul Edge's thumb and became wiser because of it, he doesn't serve much of the mentorship role that you'd expect, nor have a reason to fight Patroclus, instead just handing over SoulCalibur to this little twerp because he's a new hero even if he doesn't deserve it. And of course, placing Patroclus in a scene with Siegfried that allows us to see how far Siegfried has come since Soul Blade really highlights Patroclus' lack of development. And there were some interesting developments in this game that, unfortunately, were either only explained in bios or only hinted at through certain details, like Keelik becoming a new Edge Master, Setsuka training Patroclus between games to explain his second fighting style, Raphael being the new Nightmare Graf Dumas, or Cassandra being banished to the short-lived mobile game before showing up in SC6 and disappearing forever. And Zwei was a cool newcomer who actually got a decent amount of screen time and a tragic end. There was potential with this new cast, but the cuts and the lack of other modes to use the cast in gave players little chance to see the ideas being put forth. Was this new generation a success? It took them 6 years to make a sequel, and that game rebooted back to SoulCalibur 1's events. There are connections through alternate timeline stuff like both Cassandra's meeting, but Project Soul really just dropped them all and didn't even bring any of their weapons over for newcomers. I think the only thing that survived was Viola's theme returning for Amy's story because they're the same person. I suppose then it's a good thing 5 ended on a relatively conclusive note so that the reboot didn't cut off too many plot lines. Before it moved on to the full new generation in its 10th installment, Mortal Kombat had hints of this throughout its early history. Sub-Zero was succeeded by his brother in the second game, MK4 introduced Liu Kang's student Kai alongside Kano's replacement Jarek and potentially Fujin to replace the now Elder God Raiden. Co-creator John Tobias even planned to make a full new generation game for MK5 starring Liu Kang's son, but the idea was scrapped when he left the company. The subsequent 3D era introduced Sub-Zero's apprentice Frost, whom many fans wanted to see join the eventual new generation, and then I recall it being stated suggested that a new generation was the plan following Armageddon, which would kill off most of the cast and pave the way for a ton of newcomers. The series had a pseudo reboot instead. Ultimately, it was 2015's Mortal Kombat X that introduced a new generation. Of its 9 total newcomers, only 2 don't serve as any sort of successor or replacement. 4 are younger relatives of classic characters, 1 is the Emperor to replace Shao Kahn, 1 is the new gun-toting Lawman, and Tribog just has the abilities and colours of all 4 of the previous Cyber Ninjas. What makes MKX's new generation unique is that the core 4 successors, who are the faces of this new generation, actually still have their predecessors around. In particular, the new cast are dealing with a civil war plot, while the old cast are dealing with the Revenant plot, having the occasional interaction with their successors and acting as mentors. Not as much was done with it as I'd have liked, but it laid the foundation for those characters to be more gradually phased out, making it easier for players to accept, especially if their stories could reach natural conclusions now that they had successors to take over for them. As for the new protagonist, Cassie Cage is alright. Cassie is the daughter of Johnny Cage and Sonya Blade, and is probably a better amalgamation of her predecessors than Jin is. Jin, visually, is just a new Kazuya. Very little of Jun's influence is particularly apparent outside of his backstory, until he adopted her colour scheme in Tekken 4, which he then dropped in Tekken 6. And Rock is pretty much all Terry influence. With Cassie, she has the soldier aesthetic and blonde hair of her mother, but the general demeanour and flashy style of her father. In gameplay, she borrows more from her father, which fits with her story of being raised primarily by him, with her gameplay similarities to Sonya being more broad, such as having handguns instead of the wrist blaster things as her projectile attack to further drive this point home. And something that helps Cassie is that, like early Tekken, MK had also been swapping out its protagonists. Liu Kang was the lead for the first 4 games, then Deadly Alliance had no one in particular, but Kung Lao kinda had that position. Deception had Shujinko, Armageddon had Taven, MK vs DCU and MK9 had Raiden, and then MKX had Cassie. So while her style is as different from Liu Kang as Alex is from Ryu, Liu Kang hadn't been the protagonist since 6 games ago, so it's not too sudden a shift. But she also stands out from the rest by not being a god or a martial artist, which allows her to mark this as a new era for the franchise, but without feeling like as much of a departure as Alex does. They also somewhat sidestep the common issue of new protagonists upstaging the old ones by taking down a threat the classic cast can't by giving her a bloodline technique that gives her an edge. How successful or contrived you may see this, I think it serves its purpose well enough. I'll leave aside how feeble a fighter she is until the climax because that's a structural issue with NetherRealm games and not something to be held against her. At best it contributes to an underlying arc about her self-confidence, but that might be me trying to see something that isn't there. But her personality is what makes her stand out most, as the previous heroes of the series are a lot more serious and stoic, typically a martial artist or a god, while Cassie is a more down-to-earth, quippy character with familial expectations that many might find relatable, giving her decent setup for future stories, even if most of her arc is pretty much over by the end of her debut. And while Cassie doesn't fight Liu Kang in MKX, they do clash in MK11 and it's kind of underwhelming sadly. Which is a shame because Liu Kang is the fallen hero character who has just buried the new hero's mother under rubble that leads to her death, so Cassie fighting him should be a huge deal, but it's not. He just goes down like anyone else and escapes off screen. And then she barely interacts with the past version of Liu Kang, not even having him apologise for his future self killing her mother. Huge missed opportunities there. So was this new generation successful? As far as general fan response to the newcomers, they were accepted fairly favourably, though I doubt anyone would be fine having them fully replace their parents or mentors, especially with how set in stone most of them are as part of the modern series roster. And then the very next game axed all but 3, arguably 4 of them, and maintained its classic era roster bias, going so far as to bring past versions of those prior characters to the present to take prominence from their older, more developed counterparts and their successors. Sure, we open with Cassie Cage's chapter and she's got an entire B-plot with her past mother, but it feels more like an obligation than anything else, with Raiden and Liu Kang being the main characters again. MK11 is only beaten out as the most violent rejection of the new generation by their own series by SoulCalibur, which semi-rebooted to get rid of them. Granted, MK rebooted again at the end of MK11, and we're probably not going to get the new generation characters in MK12, maybe MK13 if they're lucky. I mean, it says a lot that half of the new generation hero quartet have been in less MK games than the Joker from Batman. DC's The Joker is, unironically, more of a series staple than Kung Jin and Takeda Takahashi, who were the most popular of the 4. I mean, come on! So, what can we take away from all of these examples? Well, first, you want to mitigate the roster upheaval. While you don't want just a handful of newcomers and that's it, you also don't want to axe the bulk of the cast, especially if the new generation is a literal generation introduced after a lengthy time skip that ages up the classic cast into middle/old age, or kills them off. You need a good balance of old and new characters, and most of the newcomers should have some sort of tie to existing characters and events to avoid the feeling of disconnection. It can be family, mentor and student, or something as small as Eddie Gordo's family dying because of Kazuya's villainy. story. These connections can also easily justify gameplay similarities, be they similar playstyles and moves, or outright taking someone else's movesets. Such gameplay successions are more important the more of the old cast you're cutting, and the longer the series has gone on for. But you also don't want the characters to just be carbon copies of old characters. They need something to make them unique. For some, that's just inheriting elements from two characters and seeing how those elements gel together. For others, it's only having the most basic similarities, such as Kung Lao's successor Kung Jin being his cousin who is also a monk with a weapon that can be used in melee or at range. Without fresh ideas, players will ask why the new generation was even bothered with if it's functionally just new designs for the old cast. I would generally advise against the large time skip transition, especially if that will result in, say, all the women over 40 getting the axe no matter how popular or significant they are. MKX is the only one to keep an older woman around in the almost 60-year-old Sonya Blade, and that's just sad. Another takeaway, though hardly practical advice for most series, is to have it happen relatively early. As stated earlier, part of what made Tekken 3's transition between generations so smooth was the fact that it was too early in the series to have many characters that a new entry would feel naked without. If you wait too long, you risk being torn between alienating a lot of fans by leaving out their favourites, and being too worried about that to give the new cast room to shine. I think overall that's everything to take away from the existing new generations. But before we close off, I'd like to discuss one more new generation fighter. Not a game, but a character, and I think you'll find this idea quite interesting. Genfu was introduced in Dead or Alive 1. He had one goal: to make enough money in the DOA tournament to pay for a life-saving operation for his granddaughter. This was the kind of story that could not drag on, as the more times Genfu came back with the same goal, the less credible his story would become. So, in DOA 3, he actually managed to get enough money to succeed, saving his granddaughter and retiring from the tournaments, which is incredibly rare in fighting games. Thus, the stage was set for a new character to take his place, and so DOA 4 introduced Elliot, Genfu's apprentice. Genfu is still in DOA 4 and 5, so Elliot doesn't use his moveset, although there are obvious similarities. Genfu does still appear in the story to test Elliot's progress, but Elliot has firmly taken Genfu's place in the story, allowing his master to conclude his narrative and not be dragged into some new arc that feels like an unnecessary extension. And with Genfu serving as Elliot's final opponent in DOA 4 and observing him in 5 to test his pupil before sitting out DOA 6 entirely, we have a very nice passing of the torch storyline between master and apprentice, the kind of new versus old setup that most new generations' main stories can't get right. And the success of this highlights how a new generation can actually be done little by little, more of a Ship of Theseus approach, letting characters retire or at least bow out for a while, a successor coming to take their place, maybe with the old moveset, maybe not, and eventually having a whole new class of fighters that leave the roster feeling radically different from where it all started, but without the pitfalls of trying to do it all at once, as has been the tradition for years. Hopefully this is something fighters like Dead or Alive can consider for their long-term plans. I mean, even Elliot was predated by Hitomi being introduced as the new karateka once Hayate switched to his ninja moveset. Even SoulCalibur had a few replacements like this before 5, like Sophitia to Cassandra, Huang to Yonsung, Lilong to Maxi, and Rock to Astaroth. I think this approach is preferable to the sudden new generation because even if your favourites are removed from the roster over time, you'll likely already have another favourite that's been introduced since that you can switch to. But what do you guys think? Are there any more takeaways from those that came before? Did any of them approach the subjects better or worse than I believe? Will SF6 blaze a new future for Street Fighter, or will the results be lukewarm? If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is SoulCalibur V, What Happened by Matt McMuscles, which was helpful for getting a few details about the game's rocky development straight.